a Soviet sea monster, half plane, half ship, 8 jet engines, nuclear missiles, beached and rusting on a deserted coast. Salvage diver Brian found it by accident. Inside, he discovered something no one was supposed to see: sealed research instruments where the warheads should be. This machine was a covert spy craft, and now he's going to rebuild it and make it skim the waves one last time. This is the Lung-class Ekranoplan, a Soviet machine that defies classification. Part ship, part jet, it flies just 12 feet above the water, invisible to radar and large enough to carry nuclear missiles. Abandoned for decades, it was left to rot until a failed tow in 2020 left it stranded on a Caspian beach. And inside, hidden where the warheads used to be, Brian found sealed instruments no one was meant to discover. Now he's assembling a team to rebuild 8 colossal engines and do what engineers have never attempted: restore a Cold War ghost to flight. The question is, what was it really built to spy on? Brian had spent years salvaging wrecks across the Caspian, but nothing prepared him for this. In the summer of 2020, he got a call about a top-secret Soviet craft being towed along the coast and then abandoned mid-operation. The tow lines had snapped, and the 380-ton monster had drifted onto a sandbar, its massive nose jutting toward the sky like a beached whale. When he first walked up to the rust-streaked hull, the scale broke his brain. The 8 forward engines alone were bigger than his truck. The wings stretched 74 meters, nearly the length of a football field. This was the MD-160, the only operational Lung-class Ekranoplan ever built, a weapon so strange that American intelligence had named it the Caspian Sea Monster decades earlier because they had no category for it. Here, what made it terrifying? Unlike a plane, it couldn't fly high, and unlike a ship, it didn't sit in the water. It rode a cushion of air locked between its stubby wings and the surface, skimming at 500 kilometers per hour, well below radar. In the 1980s, the Soviet Navy armed this machine with 6 P-270 Moscow missiles, each packing a nuclear tip and the speed to gut an aircraft carrier. It was designed to launch a sneak attack that no defense system could track. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Ekranoplan was mothballed at a remote naval base, its secrets left to molder. Brian knew the rumor that the missile tubes had been stripped long ago. But as he climbed onto the dorsal spine and popped the first hatch, his flashlight caught something the salvage crew had overlooked. Inside the launch bay, where a missile rack should have been, sat a sealed pressure vessel surrounded by cabling and instruments that looked nothing like weapons hardware. It was a research payload. Somebody had converted this nuclear missile carrier into a covert surveillance platform, and they did it without telling anyone. Now Brian had to find an engineer crazy enough to help him unravel what that payload was really meant to monitor, and to rebuild 8 dead engines so the monster could speak again. Brian knew he couldn't crack this alone. The instruments sealed inside the missile bay were nothing like he'd ever seen: optical sensors, chemical sniffers, and a hardened data recorder built to survive a crash at Mach speed. This wasn't a weapons platform. It was a spy in plain sight. He tracked down Nancy Volkov, a Russian aerospace engineer who'd once worked on ground effect control systems at the Sukhoi Design Bureau. She was one of the few people alive who understood the aerodynamics of flight in the ground cushion. When Brian sent her photos of the hidden payload, she dropped her consulting gig and drove straight to the beach. Nancy opened the access panel beneath the left wing root and found the truth. The Ekranoplan had been repurposed right after the Soviet collapse, sometime in the mid-90s. The original missile fire control system had been ripped out and replaced with a low-frequency signal monitor and a radiation detector array, all powered by a separate shielded generator. The portside intakes concealed air sampling probes. The nose radar operated in a mode designed to map undersea magnetic anomalies, not ships. This craft was listening to the Caspian seabed itself. The big question was, listening for what? Nancy traced the cable runs to a logbook sealed in a titanium case. The entries were coded, but one thing was clear. The last mission had been scrubbed mid-route, the crew recalled, and the machine towed to Caspian and locked away. It had never flown again. The restoration was already 1,000 engineering nightmares. The 8 Kuznetsov and K-87 turbofans hadn't turned over since the 90s. Salt air had fused compressor blades to their housings. Nancy calculated they'd need to rebuild each engine from scratch, machining custom turbine discs because no factory still made the alloy. The ground effect control surfaces, the hinged flaps that directed the air cushion under the wings, were seized solid. Even if they got the engines lit, the craft could go into a lethal pitch oscillation the moment it tried to lift off the water. And then there was the hull, a 380-ton aluminum beast that had sat in saltwater surf for months after the failed tow. Its airframe had microscopic cracks spreading from the stress points. They were essentially rebuilding a dead machine that wanted to kill them if they made one mistake. But the deeper they dug into the payload, the stranger it got. The sensor logs showed that the Ekranoplan had been repeatedly flying a precise grid pattern over a section of the Caspian that had no known military or geological activity. The recordings matched no known natural signal. Nancy cross-referenced old Soviet research papers and found a single reference to a geological survey project codenamed Atlas, officially canceled in 1988. But these sensors were still actively logging data when the last flight was aborted in 1999. The machine had been hunting something underwater that the official records said didn't exist. And the last log entry wasn't a routine shutdown. It was an error code marked, "Containment breach detected." Now Brian and Nancy faced an impossible timeline. The Russian heritage authorities were threatening to seize the wreck unless they could prove restoration was viable. The local community wanted it gone, calling it an eyesore. And a former naval officer who claimed to have served on the Lund's last mission had started posting cryptic warnings online. "You don't know what you're waking up." Brian ordered a set of custom titanium turbine blades anyway. The clock was ticking, and the first engine test was scheduled in 3 weeks. What they didn't know was that the containment breach warning wasn't a malfunction. It was exactly what the instruments were designed to detect. The warning code wasn't a glitch. Nancy pulled the raw sensor logs from the titanium case and ran them through a ground penetration sonar database she'd borrowed from a geological survey firm. What came back stopped her cold. During its final mission in 1999, the Ekranoplan had been crisscrossing a patch of seabed roughly 20 kilometers offshore, directly above a site where Soviet-era boreholes had been drilled into an underwater salt dome. Those boreholes had been sealed and forgotten, at least officially. But the Lund's chemical sniffers had picked up 2 things that should never have been in the water: dissolved methane at extreme concentrations and a specific radionuclide signature, cesium-137. That combination told Nancy one terrifying story: a breached nuclear waste repository. The Soviet Union had been dumping spent reactor cores and chemical weapons residue into those boreholes, counting on the salt to seal it forever. It hadn't held. This changed everything. Brian realized that the real reason the machine was mothballed wasn't budget cuts. The monitoring flights were stopped because what they found was so politically explosive that Moscow buried the whole project. The former naval officer posting online. He was one of the final crew members. He knew that if the Ekranoplan flew again, the sensors would reboot and transmit their findings to whatever satellite network still had ears. That data could expose an environmental catastrophe that Russia had spent decades denying. The warnings weren't about waking the machine. They were about waking the truth. Nancy called an emergency meeting on the beach. They had 2 weeks before the heritage authorities would declare the wreck abandoned and hand it over to scrappers. That meant they had 2 weeks to finish restoring enough of the engines and control surfaces to achieve a single low-altitude test run, and to keep the sensor payload intact and recording. If they succeeded, they'd have irrefutable evidence of the breach. If they failed, the machine would be cut into scrap metal, and the data logs destroyed by whoever wanted the past to stay buried. The engineering problems multiplied. The hull cracks had reached a structural longeron near the tail, and the only way to fix it was to weld a new aluminum plate in place while the craft sat on an incline in the sand, with the tide pushing in twice a day. Nancy rigged a portable welding station powered by 2 diesel generators, but the salt corrosion had weakened the frame so badly that one wrong heat application could warp the entire aft section beyond repair. Meanwhile, Brian and his crew were rebuilding engine number 4, the one that had to ignite first to stabilize the air cushion. They pulled an all-nighter machining a new compressor disc from the titanium blanks they'd ordered, only to find that the fuel lines feeding it were clogged with hardened Soviet-era residue, a compound so toxic they had to wear hazmat suits just to clear it. 3 days before the test, the ex-naval officer showed up in person. His name was Mikko, and he wasn't there to stop them. He handed Brian a yellowed logbook, the missing pilot's diary from the 1999 mission. It described the moment they realized what they were flying over: a seabed littered with corroded canisters, some ruptured, and a plume of methane so thick it was bubbling to the surface. They'd been ordered to abort and return to base, and the entire crew was sworn to secrecy under threat of imprisonment. Mikkel told them the breach had only gotten worse in the decades since. The methane was now eating away at the salt walls, accelerating the release, and the sensors on the Ekranoplan were the only ones ever built to map it from the air. Brian made a decision that would bet everything on a single flight. He told the crew to install the sensor array back into the missile bay and wire it to the main power bus. They would fire up all 8 engines, drop the flaps, and skim the exact coordinates of the original containment breach. The world would see what the Soviets tried to hide. The test was set for dawn on the calmest day forecasted, because if the waves got above 2 feet, the ground effect would fail, and the monster would slam into the sea. Brian stood under the nose of the Lun, engines cold but ready, and looked out at the gray Caspian. The final question wasn't whether she would fly, but what would happen when she transmitted her findings to a world that wasn't ready to know. Dawn broke flat and silver over the Caspian. The forecast had promised a calm sea, and for once the weather held its end of the bargain. Brian gave the signal from the open hatch of the nose gear bay. Nancy, stationed inside the cramped cockpit, ran the ignition sequence. Engine number 4 coughed, spat black smoke, and then caught. The sound was like a thunderclap swallowed by a steel drum. One by one, the remaining 7 engines lit, each staggered 5 seconds apart to prevent a surge that could rip the aging airframe apart. Dust and salt spray kicked up from the beach in a cloud so thick that Brian vanished for a moment, then reappeared with one hand gripping a stabilizer strut, shouting pressure readings that no one could hear. The ground effect flaps dropped. The wings, stubby and thick, caught the blast of jet wash and began to channel it downward. The lung-class Ekranoplan shuddered, its 380-ton mass grinding against the wet sand. Then the cushion formed. 4 feet of compressed air lifted the hull clear of the beach. The beast was no longer a ship, no longer a plane, but something in between, skimming on a bubble of its own making. Nancy pushed the throttle forward and the craft slewed into the water, accelerating across the calm surface at 50 kilometers an hour, then 100, then 250. The altimeter needle held steady at 12 feet. They were flying. Brian had mounted a live telemetry link to the sensor array in the portside missile bay. As the Ekranoplan crossed the invisible boundary of the original survey grid, the instruments woke up. Radiation detectors spiked. The chemical sniffers lit with methane concentrations that maxed out the scale. The ground penetration sonar painted a picture of the seabed below, a field of collapsed boreholes leaking a plume of cesium-137 that stretched for nearly 15 kilometers. The containment breach was not just real, it was orders of magnitude worse than the Soviet data had suggested. Nancy routed the readings to an uplink satellite before anyone could decide to pull the plug. Within minutes, environmental monitoring stations in 3 countries picked up the broadcast. The flight lasted 17 minutes. Nancy brought the Ekranoplan around in a wide banking turn that would have been impossible for any other vehicle at that altitude, riding the cushion like a hovercraft on ice. The final approach took them directly over the derelict pier at Durban, where a small crowd that had gathered to protest the restoration now stood silent, phone cameras raised. as the Cold War Ghost raced past them at 300 kilometers per hour, its 8 engines blazing, the spray trailing behind in a white plume visible for miles. Brian crossed the now-silent sensor bay and pulled a small titanium box from beneath the data recorder. The box was sealed with a wax stamp bearing the insignia of the Caspian flotilla. Inside was a handwritten letter from Captain Sergei Kulikov, the pilot of the final 1999 mission. It read, "If you are reading this, the Lund flies again. I am sorry we could not finish our work. The truth is under the salt. Do not let them bury it twice." When Brian stepped onto the beach after the landing, the data was already trending worldwide. Within 48 hours, the Russian government would announce an emergency inspection of the offshore disposal site. An international consortium would begin drafting plans for a containment operation that would take a decade to complete. The Caspian Sea monster, once a weapon of war, had become the only witness to a crime the world had forgotten. And for the first time since its engines fell silent, the truth was airborne. The Lung-class Ekranoplan was built to disappear. A machine that could strike without warning, then melt into the sea haze before anyone knew it was there. But in the end, it became the opposite of invisible. It became the only thing that could see what had been hidden beneath the Caspian for decades. Brian and Nancy didn't just restore a Cold War relic. They gave a voice to a machine that was never allowed to speak, and the truth it carried was louder than any missile it once held. There are wrecks all over the world, rusting on forgotten coastlines, buried in deserts, sunk in harbors. Some of them are still carrying secrets. The question isn't whether they'll ever fly again. It's whether someone will be brave enough to listen. If you want to see the full blueprint for how they rebuilt the engines or the unedited sensor data from the flight, we've put everything in the description. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next time we dig up a monster that the world tried to forget. See you out there.